we'll move on. Finish up a few things I did not mention on chapter 2. Raha, this is from chapter 2 on India. Great one. Maha, Raha, very, very great one. Anyway, and something else I did not say about the rule of the fishes. India had a tradition of pacifism. And I think I mentioned this class out that I believe that pacifism leads to war. If people think that you aren't willing to go to war, they'll come in and attack you and take everything you have. And we found that out between World War I and World War II. Between the wars, there was a strong pacifist movement into this scenario, particularly in Mussolini. And we had the biggest war the world has ever seen. And the same thing, but on a smaller scale, happened in India. All right. With that out of the way, I want to move on to the chapter on China. But before I do, the test will be on chapters 2 and 3. And until recently, I'd always put chapters 2 and 3 with chapter 1, but I want to emphasize chapter 1. So I gave it a test myself, I gave it a test by itself. But anyway, chapters 2, chapter 3. Now, the past 2. Do all of you know what the past 2 is about? Yeah, who knows? I mean, I've given it to you. It's map skill. I have given it to you. 18 places I want you to be able to identify. I mean, I showed you the test. Name the 18 places. So, now I've had students try to put down Australia. I won't give you points for that. It's not one of the places we visited this semester. 18 places we'll talk about this semester. No, don't try putting down Australia or Indonesia or any such place. But the places we'll visit this semester. And write them in on the map. All right. And then this next test will have fewer questions than the other one did, but it'll be the same format. Blank, a bunch of words. The words will be names, philosophies, religions, ideas, or places, rivers. Now, folks, if you see Yangtze, put down it's a river in China. At least put down it's not China. Don't just put down river. I'll count off a couple of points for that. It's a river in China. Are we clear on that? Give me a place. And if you put down, for a philosopher, was he a Chinese? I mean, it's going to be China or was it a Chinese or Indian philosopher? Or if it's a religion, was it a Chinese or Indian religion? I mean, put down the place. Hopefully that's simple enough. But so I'll grade it similar to the way I graded the other one. But don't just put down a ruler or a king. If he was a ruler of what country? China or India? In this case, you only have 2 choices. For the other one, you had a bunch of choices. All right, I'll move on. Chapter 3. Yes?
So is it Raha or Raja?
Raha. Well, it's spelled R-A-J-A, but I believe it's pronounced Raha.
Yeah. So what is that a title?
Just a minute.
In India, you spell it as Raja and Maharaja.
Raja. Okay.
Yeah, because it's mostly
backwards.
from British accent, so it's spelled as Raja.
It's spelled Raja because of the British.
That's what.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I hope that answers your question.
No, but I was wondering is that a title or is that an actual person?
It's a name. Go ahead. Nomenclature.
It's Raja is a king, and Maharaja is the supreme king, kind of.
Title is more correct.
I wasn't sure if
not an
was
actual
like
individual.
person
It's
or
a title. It's a title. Yeah, like general.
That just count.
Yeah, or colonel.
Okay.
Colonel is one rank. General is a higher rank. Yeah, it's a title.
I was just trying to get some context.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very good. I mean, it's not the name. And yeah, I capitalized it, didn't I? Well, no, it's a title. I mean, all right. China, it's surrounded by to huge mountains over here, the world's tallest, surrounded by a bunch of desert throughout here and here, and surrounded by ocean here. So that isolated China from most of the rest of humanity. Of course, it was bordered here in the south by Vietnam, and then over to the east was Japan, and less to the east was Korea. But for the most part, China grew up in isolation. As was the case of all these civilizations, its cities began along the banks of rivers. The two big Chinese rivers are the Yellow and Yangtze. Now, some of you might know a little bit about geography. We have a river called the Yellow River here, but it's not in any way comparable to the Chinese Yellow River. The Chinese Yellow River is quite huge. The Yellow River we have here is not much more than a creek, with all due respects. But anyway, the Chinese started out in the banks of rivers. Now, in China, only about 12% of their land is arable. That means capable of being farmed, or can farm. About a small percentage. All right. Now this holds still true what I'm about to say. That means that much of China's population is concentrated in a small area. Now, unlike the United States, where we have a population center here, a population center here, a population center over here, and a population center here, and a big population center here, and then lesser population, well, a big population center right in here around the Lake Michigan. We have a dozen or more big population centers. In China, China proper, this area here is the big main population center, and they have most of the people crunched together here, and the rest of the people are scattered out in much less inhabited areas. And I was reminded of this when I was in high school, when a person who was soon to be a congressman came and spoke to us, and he said that if we ever went to war with China, they brag that they have more people than we do, but their people is bunched together while our people are more scattered. Now, in today's world, I don't know how much of a difference that would make. All right. Also, before I proceed talking about China, I want to state this. Up until the year 1500, these people were the most creative, inventive people who ever lived, except for possibly the Sumerians. They invented paper, the printing press, steel, silk, porcelain, the shoulder harness, the movable rudder on a boat, movable sails, a fore and aft rigging on sails, which made the sails able to catch more wind. I mean, these people were highly inventive, and I want to start a wheelbarrow for one, we have paper money, the banking system. Both their inventions should have enabled them to burst out from their domain and overspread the whole globe and rule over the whole world. But they didn't. There have been all kinds of reasons why they didn't. It's like their inventions got them so far, and then they stopped. And we'll later on talk about possible reasons for this, but that's a subject for a later chapter. These people were highly inventive, highly creative, and again, could have possibly accomplished great things, and who knows, they still might accomplish a lot of great things. Now, to the north now, they had a constant problem with their Mongolian neighbors. These Mongolians would just sneak in, take whatever they could, sneak up on an unsuspecting village. To keep the Mongolians out, the Chinese built their Great Wall. Which still stands. It's one of the wonders of the world. The Great Wall was not always of even construction. Some of it has lasted to this day, some of it has crumbled. Some of it has undergone some extensive repair. Now, I had a pupil at another college about 4 or 5 years ago who did his paper on the Great Wall, and he said the Great Wall was a big, expensive mistake. That what the Chinese should have done was trained an army and had a trained army. Well, he was thinking in terms of modern day history, where we have helicopters and telephones and radios and global positioning systems and all that stuff that they didn't have then. The fact is, no matter how many men China would have trained, the Mongolians would have been able to sneak around them and sneak where they knew the army was not, and then get whatever they wanted. They would take away a person's wives and children and families, and not to mention all their valuables. So it was quite a problem. The Chinese did, in fact, try to train an army, but the army could not be everywhere at once. So probably the best solution they had was build a wall, which would hopefully discourage the Mongolians from coming in, and for the most part did. Now later we'll talk about one Mongolian who broke through the wall, Genghis Khan by name. All right. China's history has a lot in common with Egypt's also. Chinese writing, at least to me, with my, I guess, untrained eyes, Chinese writing looks a lot like Egyptian hieroglyphics. If that isn't enough, the Chinese were very concerned that their kings have a happy afterlife, much like the Egyptians. The Egyptians would bury a lot of their treasure with their pharaohs, and the Chinese would bury a lot of treasure with the emperors. Very concerned that the emperors had a happy afterlife. And, oh yes, the Chinese and Egyptians both wrote their history based on their dynasties. But whereas the Egyptians numbered their dynasties, first dynasty, second dynasty, third dynasty, the Chinese named their dynasties after their family names. There was no first, second, or third. It was simply a matter of the Han dynasty, the Sung dynasty, and the Tang dynasty, that they named them. And they went, like the Egyptians, from one dynasty to another. A dynasty would take over and rule for a while, then due to weakness on the part of that dynasty, they would fade out and another strong man would take over and he'd found a new dynasty. And this was to go on until 1905. Now, the Chinese are the only one of these ancient cultures that survived intact up until the 20th century. Now, you notice I didn't say 21st. The Chinese kept their civilization until the year 1949, when the communists took over and for all practical purposes, made a new civilization. You can't say Egypt is the same, because Egypt went through a period where it was Christianized, then Islam took over, and the same thing for all this part of the world. Islam eventually was to take over and change things. But China was to remain the same, at least have what we call the same civilization throughout ancient times until the year 1949. All right. Now, ancient Chinese, they tended to live in villages, and the villages, the family life was organized in what we would call clans or extended family. You were considered family if you were descended from the same great grandfather. That meant your first cousins and second cousins, at least on your father's side. Now, not necessarily the same great-great-grandfather on your mother's side, but if you were descended from the same great-great-grandfather on your father's side, then you were considered part of a family. We would call it a clan or now, the purpose of this was very early in their history. Their main crop that they grew was rice. And rice requires community work. There was intensive labor on a part of a large number of people. So they had to keep the village together and cultivate the rice fields. And some of this still holds true. They still based a family unit on the basis of clans, if you're part of the same great-great-grandfather, and they still grow a lot of rice. Any of you who know anything about rice growing, it's not done by using tractors and combines and weepers. It's grown the same old way it's been grown for thousands of years. During much of the rice's lifetime, it's underwater, and it has to be worked by people wading in the water and bending over and working the paddies, and that is very back-wrenching work and very, very difficult work at best, and very intensive, and always there's a risk that you'll get leeches attacking you while you're under the water, wading underwater. But nevertheless, they do a lot of rice growing, and always have and still do. Now, all right. Their political history. Now, as is the case of all ancient peoples, their earlier history is not widely believed by historians. According to their account, they started their history with 3 sovereigns. Your book names them. No, don't worry about the names of each one of these sovereigns. Each of these sovereigns, the first one taught them how to plant, and the next one taught them how to raise cattle and sheep and domesticate animals, so on and so forth, and how to use rope and string and some basic stuff. But supposedly these 3 sovereigns ruled one after another. Today we don't have real proof that these sovereigns actually existed, so they're looked on as being legendary at best. Then you have a dynasty after the 3 sovereigns. Xia, I believe, now Xia it's spelled. Xia, thank you, Xia, okay. Oh yeah, I see it, yeah, Xia. Xia dynasty, and again the Xia dynasty is looked on as being somewhat legendary also. We don't know if it actually existed, or if it's just a fabrication by later Chinese, or if it existed, how much power and authority did it really have, because sometimes these ancients, when writing their history, would take liberties to alter it and change it. So we don't have any actual original sources of this dynasty. And that's not to say we won't someday find a castle or the palace of some of the members of this dynasty. But the first dynasty that we look at as being truly historical is the Shang dynasty. Yeah, I'm looking at page 66 now. Shang. Now, a lot of these Chinese words are not spelled in English the way they sound, but this one apparently is. Anyway, the Shang dynasty, we believe, they're historical because we've actually found artifacts from them, found at least part of the palace, and well, actually, I'll take something back I just said. Your book says that we now have confirmed the existence of the Xia dynasty. Okay, Shang dynasty, we also certain they existed. One of the earlier kings buried himself with some 6,000 terracotta figures, of which no 2 were alike. These figures are believed to be statues of palace servants and soldiers. Now, they were life-size. The average one was about 6 foot tall, and if that's to be believed, then the average Chinese way back there might have been quite tall, taller than the average Chinese person today. But anyway, these terracotta figures were brought here to Atlanta once and placed in the Civic Center. Regrettably, I did not go see them. But it was believed by the Chinese that by placing these figures in his grave site, that he was carrying the people with him into the next life. Now, this is more sane than what some of the rulers did in some other places, where that when the king died, all his close servants and top generals were killed so that they could accompany him to the next life. But at least he took statues into his grave instead of actual persons. and again, they were similar to the Egyptians in that they were looking forward to giving their emperor a happy afterlife. Now, I must state, and this was true throughout most all the ancient world, your average ordinary person had very little to look forward to in the way of an afterlife. That is one reason why Christianity made the headway it did in Europe when it got started. Was Christianity promised a happy afterlife for all, rich and poor alike. But well, in India, yeah, you might say, well, didn't India have it promised a happy afterlife? Yeah, after you went through 1,000 or more years, 1,000 years of going through endless cycles, eventually, sometime during one of your cycles, you might reach the ultimate state. But then again, you might get all the way up to a king in this life and mouse up as a king and come back as a pauper in the next and have to start all over. So, they might slip up somewhere along the way. But other than that, you don't find much in a way of a happy afterlife for the ordinary person in the ancient world. These people apparently used bones to determine the will of the gods, and this was something they were really concerned about. What does our gods want us to do? And they would kill an animal and you might say scrape the meat off his bones, and whatever color the meat, the bone, whatever color the bone had, this was to indicate, this was used to determine, well, our God is telling us one thing or our God is telling us another, because they believed the spirits of the gods resided inside the bodies of animals, and that they could determine the will of the gods this way, similar to what Europeans would do when they would open up an animal and study the color of the animal's intestines to determine the will of the gods that way. After the Shang dynasty came the Zhou dynasty, and it was to last 900 years, the longest in Chinese history. Let's see. Now, if I mispronounced it, you're welcome to correct it. Yeah. Cho? Okay. Okay. J, like. Joe. Okay, thank you. J, okay. Zhou dynasty. And this one lasted longer than the others. 900 years, quite lengthy. The Han dynasty was to come later, was to last some 400 years. Now, these dynasties believed that they had a mandate from heaven, and here, folk, this is something that has quite a bit to do with their religion. Their religion, at first, all right, to start off with, they worshipped Shangdi. Now, this Shangdi has reminded some people of the Indian deus, the Spanish Dios, the Greek Theos. It's almost like all these gods were manifestations of the same God back when humanity was all together. But the worship of one God eventually faded in importance. So Shangdi just faded in importance, and numerous other gods took its place. But for the most part, these gods were completely unnamed. So they would refer to the spirit world as being heaven. A dynasty came on the scene when heaven willed. Heaven was the myriad of unnamed, just endless numbers of spirit beings that reside in a place called heaven. When heaven willed something, then it happened on earth. And a dynasty would rule as long as it had heaven's blessing. And then when, after a certain amount of time, heaven would reject that dynasty, and the dynasty would fade out of existence. Again, very, very impersonal. Not like the Europeans who had a name for their gods, and even Christianity named its founder Jesus Christ. But the Chinese, once they quit worshiping Shangdi, simply their gods were very, very impersonal, and in a lot of ways very, very distant and very unreachable. Once they made up their minds, there was nothing any human could do to change their minds. You were better off if you could just find out what they want to do and follow along with the flow, rather than try to determine your own destiny and your own path. That's one reason why they would open up animals and study their bones, hoping to determine the will of heaven that way. But anyway, dynasties had a mandate from heaven, and this was the way that they got into power, because heaven willed it, and the way they stayed in power as long as heaven willed it. And then, of course, their power ended when heaven did not will it. Economically, the number one occupation was farming, and folk, this is true in all the ancient world. At least 90% of the people were farmers. They did have a merchant class, but the merchant as being property of the nobles, and the merchants were frowned on. Now, one reason why China might not have excelled was they did not realize the value of a merchant class, and farming was looked on as being the highest occupation, and every other occupation, especially trading, buying and selling, was looked down on. This was a problem that you find in much of the Far East. And again, folk, without trade, you cannot have an advanced society. They did not see it that way. But their merchants were not looked on as being very high in society. The attempt to gain wealth was looked on as being greedy and therefore undesirable. All this was to lead to the Chinese. It's like it set the limits. They could only go so high and then bounce down. Only go so high and bounce back down. They simply could not advance very highly. One thing that they did was they developed iron plows. I believe that's during the Zhou dynasty. Now, what is so great about this is a lot of people in the world were superstitious. They believed that iron ruined the soil. The Chinese quickly developed iron plows, and the iron plows enabled them to turn over more soil. And then, and this may seem kind of trite, but it was very revolutionary, they put the horse's collar on his shoulder instead of on his neck. And again, if you can imagine a horse trying to pull a plow with a harness attached to its neck, and it's a wonder the poor animal didn't choke to death. But then, so I got the brilliant idea, put that harness down on his shoulder, and that horse can pull a whole lot bigger of a load, both as when he's pulling a cart and pulling a plow. And again, this was a very revolutionary invention, the shoulder harness. And it was to take Europeans hundreds of years to develop the shoulder harness, and if they hadn't copied from the Chinese, it's hard to tell when they might have developed it, because Europeans were still attaching their harness to the horse's neck. And again, horses today would have the last laugh if they could see human beings being strapped to a shoulder harness. But hopefully all of you use a shoulder harness every time you drive. Yeah. But anyway, horses were used in the main part of the Chinese used with horses. Now, about this time too, the Chinese learned how to sail in the ocean with rudders and with movable sails. Now, for instance, supposing the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way, how do you do it? Now, it can be done. Anybody know? How would you do it? If you're in a sailboat, I don't get quite what you say. The wind is blowing against the way you want to go. You zigzag. Go ahead. Your boat, you turn your boat first this way, and then turn your boat this way. And when you turn your boat this way, you spread the sail out such that it will grab the wind. And then when you're going with the wind, but you will move in a zigzag direction. When you zig this way, again, you'll spread your sail out such that you'll grab the wind. But you simply move the boat in a zigzag fashion and you can sail against the wind. Or if the wind is blowing to the side, let's say the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way, well, you simply angle your sails like so. And wait, actually, I've got to draw that differently. If your boat is shaped like this, and the wind is going this way, you would angle your sail like this, catch the wind, and the wind would let you go at right angles to the, you could make your boat go at right angles to the wind. The Chinese developed this long before the Europeans did. In their farming, the Chinese who learned to use what your book calls natural fertilizer, that's putting it kind of in what greatly watered down terms without telling what natural fertilizers meant. They used human waste. Human waste is known to be the best that humans can use for fertilizing land. However, most other places in the world will not use it. But the Chinese did this, and they grew excellent crops with it. They also learned to let land lie fallow for a time to put nutrients and minerals back in the soil. The word fallow means it's where you do not plant a certain field for a year. They practice crop rotation. This year they plant one crop in field number 1. Next year they plant a different crop in field number 1. The third year they wouldn't plant anything in field number 1. That field number 1 lie idle, and but they rotate the crops. And it was because it's known now that certain types of crops will take certain nutrients from the soil, but let the land sit and plow, and these nutrients will eventually find their way back into the soil. So they learned to practice crop rotation, and they learned how to let land go along without use for a year. The Qin dynasty, again spelled in English Q-I, whoops, not Q-U, but Q-I-N, but pronounced Qin. They began to build the Great Wall of China. And it actually was a Qin dynasty. The first emperor was the one who left the terracotta figures. Again, showing that the Qin dynasty spent a lot of money on preparing for the afterlife. Oh yeah, I have not mentioned that one reason I think that Chinese history and Egyptian history have a lot in common is, if you look on this map I referred to the first day of class, a lot of the Chinese came from this region of Africa and spread their way across this part of the world, coming from the Middle East. Now, and something else about the origin of some of the Chinese people we now know, and this was something we only discovered in the last 30 years, that a lot of Chinese way back there were in fact Caucasian. So we didn't know at first that Caucasians ever came to China, but now we know they do. But apparently China actually copied from Egypt because Egypt was the homeland to a lot of them. All right. After the Qin dynasty came the Han dynasty, and the Han dynasty was to last some 400 years. One of the rulers of the Han dynasty was Wang Mang. I'm not going to ask you to learn that name, even though I did some research on him. I will say this though about him, because I think it's important. He will not be on the test. Wang Mang grew up, he was related to the royal family, more distant than most of the emperors, but nevertheless, through a little bit of good luck and good fortune, he got to be emperor by currying favor with the emperor's wife for one. He wound up, and because he had grown up, among royalty, he was among the poorest of the royalty, so he really had sympathy for the poor, and he made an attempt to help the poor, and it proved to be his undoing. And you might say, isn't it noble for government to help the poor? I wonder it might be something maybe that you haven't heard before. When the government gets involved in welfare, The government that does so goes bankrupt. Welfare is the business of private individuals and private organizations and not the business. Now, if any of you want to dispute that, I'll listen. But it's not just, I mean, not just the United States and Western Europe. They are socialistic countries. Korea, sometimes, their governments try to help the poor with disastrous results. There have been attempts made to take land from the rich and redistribute among the poor, again, with always with disastrous results. Why is that? Because people who are given handouts do not know how to manage that. Well, the same reason they got into poverty in the first place is the same reason they can't manage it when somebody hands them some wealth in the form of money. And if you ever see a beggar, and I've done this before, don't give him money. They might take him to the nearest restaurant. I mean, I met a beggar once at Arby's, and I bought him a meal. I said, hey, this is the same place where I bring my family sometimes, not all the time, but I bring my family. I eat this food myself, so here's a meal. I didn't give him a thin dime. They can't handle it. What would he have done with the money I gave him? Probably buy booze. I asked him, what's booze? Well, anyway, probably buy booze. Yes?
What about socialist programs like
free education? In America, our free education system is in a really, really bad state. Chaos and down there. It's known education is better off if done by private individuals or even by home. I have 3 children, and not many of them ever saw the inside of public school. I've been in public school for 5.5 years, and that's why my children, most educators either homeschool their kids or send their kids to private school. Right? Need I say more? All right, I mean, if you want to dispute what I'm saying, you're welcome to. I don't want to argue with you, but I will at least listen to you. The problem with welfare is it creates a class of dependents, where they get to where they're dependent on the government, and then you can make more money off welfare than you can make working for McDonald's. So, hey, why not collect the money from the government and not work? If you get your job at McDonald's, then they'll cut off the welfare, well, which they should, but that's something else. But anyway, the Chiang Wang had disaster results trying to help the poor. Now, again, during the Han Dynasty, they invented the rudder, the fore and aft rigging for sailing vessels. Oh yes, and they invented paper. The ancient Egyptians and Sumerians had woven reeds together to make what they called papyrus, but that was not true paper. True paper is actually made from wood. And the Chinese invented the paper. Again, very, very important. The inventions that they made should have propelled them to the top of the world. Religion, very important. All of you have seen this. This has nothing to do with me, by the way. Unless, no, nothing to do with me. And yes, I do like the water, but, all right. Now, generally, more primitive religions consist of belief in spirit beings like animism, and apparently way back yonder in early history, they had the beliefs in animism. Then they began to believe in a transcendent God, which is generally looked on as being more advanced. Animism. This is spirit worship. Or you might say nature worship. Everything is God. Everything, the river is God, the stars are God, the trees are God. That's animism. Shamanism. Again, also generally associated with primitive people. Another name for a shaman is witch man or witch doctor. They believe that they contact the spirit. Well, what they do is they take a certain drug that puts them in a trance-like state. Now, folk, don't any of you try this unless you're trained in it, because a lot of persons have gone into this trance-like state and have never come out. Again, But they believe that they go in a trance-like state, and then when they wake up, they try to recall what they saw in the spirit world. And I'm not going to say it's all a bunch of bunk, because some of their medicines are actually known to have some value, and they can actually cure some diseases. But as is the case of all medicines, there's always some things that you run into that you cannot fix or cannot cure. Yes?
What kind of drugs do they use? What kind of drugs do they use?
I don't know how to pronounce it, and I'll tell you, I'd better not give it out. But, it's Ayacausa. Most of you probably never heard of it. Yes.
Is it a tea?
It might depend on which part of the world. I mean, shamanism is found over the world. It was found among the American Indians in North America, the African primitive peoples, the primitive peoples of Southeast Asia, and at one time in China. It's generally associated only with primitive peoples, and not with, yes?
What's the difference between pantheism and animism?
I don't know if there is any. The word pan means everything is God. So I really don't know the distinction. There probably is one, but as far as I know, they're pretty close to the same. Again, mostly associated with primitive people. Then the more advanced religions are the religions of civilized folk. And eventually the Chinese emperors moved the people away from from shamanism, animism, to worship of more gods. Now, they have another unique concept. The yang and the yin. Yang and yin. Yang, the sun, yin, the moon. And they believe that everything about the universe consists of keeping a harmony and a balance between these two forces. All right. And they even went to the field of medicine. Now, if you go to a doctor complaining that you're feeling really badly, he might run a series of tests and decide, well, you have a problem with the lack of this chemical. So he'll give you medicine that will elevate that chemical, or maybe you have too much of a chemical. He'll give you medicine that will tone down that chemical. But it's much more complicated than just the yang and yin, the opposite forces. But now, if any of you study quantum or any kind of physics, you'll know that electricity consists of two states, positive and negative. They attract, the positive, negative, then positive repels positive, negative repels negative. Magnetism and electricity and magnetism is one of the forces that make up the universe. Magnetism has a north and a south. North repels north. I mean, you have a north end to a north end, and they repel each other. North, though, attracts the south. Again, this is what you might have learned in elementary school or junior high school or whatever. North and south. And in other words, this makes up electricity and magnetism, electromagnetism. And some people believe it does extend even deeper into quantum. But it also appears to me to get a little bit more complicated than just two opposing forces and to have to be kept in some kind of harmony and unity. But nevertheless, they believed that that these two had to be kept in balance. But the study of the yang and yin led to a fatalism, which we find among people who believe in predestination. And we're going to run into this word fatalism. We talked about Greek literature. Fatalism means that what will be, and there's nothing we can do about it. Our destiny is predetermined, and we're just helpless at the forces of nature that totally determine our destiny. Now, folk, I want to pause and say when I'm teaching about this stuff, in no way does that mean that I necessarily believe it. All these philosophies that I've studied, they have a ring of truth to them. They're true under certain conditions, but not true under all conditions. Yes, there are times when things happen to us that we have absolutely no control over and did not bring on ourselves and cannot help. And there are times when we can take responsibility. But even among Christians who believe in predestination, they believe that your destiny is completely controlled and you have no choice in the matter whatever. What will be, and there's nothing at all we can do about it. Some mysterious law of nature just seemed to control everything. All right, which brings us up to Confucius. In my, I have to say, limited study of Chinese philosophers and Chinese philosophy, I have been impressed with how many Chinese philosophers were not honored during their own lifetime, but had honors heaped upon them. More than one of their philosophers were actually killed outright, and then honored as a great person after he was gone. Confucius was not killed for his beliefs, but he did not get honor. Now, in those days, to be a philosopher, you had to get some rich person to sponsor you. And Confucius, you might say, had a very difficult time finding a job. He was not highly regarded, and yet after he was gone, he was honored, and the Chinese called their religion Confucianism for the next 2,600 years or 2,300 years after he died. When we study Greece, we'll talk about Socrates. These men's lives overlapped. One of them died when the other was 8 years old, but I don't know which one came first. But I do know their lives overlapped by 8 years. And some people even wonder if one of them did not influence the other one. Anyway, we sometimes call Confucianism a religion. Others say it actually is more of a philosophy than a religion. We do not know, and the same thing could be applied to Buddha. We do not know if Confucius even believed that there was a God, or even believed in the spirit world. His philosophy had to do with the here, the now, this world, the practical, with almost nothing said about anything about the life and the hereafter. And in fact, his religion was so materialistic that a lot of Chinese, to find more spirituality, embraced the alternate religion, namely Taoism, which I'll get to in a minute. And another big weakness of his religion is that Confucianism offered no comfort to a young mother who has just lost a child due to some illness that they could not cure. And Confucianism never promised any kind of consolation or solace, or you'll see this child again in the next life, nothing like that. There simply was no solace given to a grieving parent, or for that matter to anyone else who was grieving. There's simply nothing much said about any form of an afterlife. Confucius' main belief, as you remember before, is that everybody had his own doll, or his own. Now, the nearest word we have to that in English language is way. Everybody had his own way. So if you wanted to live one way, and somebody else was living another way, well, maybe that was just his doll, and you had your own doll, and the other person had their own doll, so they might do things that you consider wrong, but then again, if that's their doll, who's to say that it's wrong? Who is anybody else to judge them? Because they're following their own, you might say they're beating to a different drummer, so they're following their own drummer, and you can follow your drummer. Each person was to follow his own way, or to find his own doll and follow it. Again, it would all depend on your individual role in life. So much he had to say was political and ethical, and if Chinese would say to each other when they were quarreling, Confucius say this, Confucius say this, supposedly to settle an argument, if Confucius had any sayings that dealt with a certain matter. In the field of politics, Confucius believed that the government should do the will of the people. And again, our Thomas Jefferson would really applaud him for saying that, because Thomas Jefferson believed the same thing. And the government, as long as the government did what the people wanted, there'd be harmony. So it's up to the government. Basically, I mean, what I hear from this is, at one time our leaders in our country said, I believe this, if you believe that, follow me. But modern day politicians will say, in effect, tell me what you believe. Whatever you believe, I'll believe that, then you can follow me. No leadership as such. It's all, the government becomes the follower. The people become the leader. The Again, each of you can decide for yourself what's right about it. My own take is that each of these philosophies have a kernel of truth and some kernel of error, and a mix of truth and error, such that it's difficult to determine truth from error. Now, Confucius is said to have met the founder of the next religion, the founder of Taoism. The two men talked at an inn. They could not understand each other. Then the founder of Taoism went out into the snow, leaving his papers behind, was never seen again. His papers were picked up by his followers and used to construct a religion. As for Confucius, he was eventually going to go on and found a religion that was to govern China. You might well govern, or to be the philosophical foundation for Chinese thought for many, many generations. What you do in life is find out what the universe wanted to do, and if you could get yourself in harmony with the universe, which to me sounds like just drift along with the flow, which way the flow is going, you go that way, drift along with the wind and tide, then you'll be okay. Again, that's Confucius, not necessarily me. He also believed that people should be appointed to government positions based on their ability to perform and not on whether or not they had a birthright. In other words, if your father were a general and the army decided that you're just not capable of leading men, you should not be appointed general just because your father was. But if you had a younger brother who had the traits that armies look for when they pick their generals, then your younger brother might become a general and you'd be left out. But the idea that was really common among Chinese was that the government jobs went to the persons who appeared to be the most qualified without regard to birth or birthright. Again, Confucius led the way in teaching this because, again, some people whose fathers made excellent government positions, the sons would oftentimes flop. All right. After Confucius passed on, he became very highly regarded. The next philosopher after him was Mencius. Mencius was a disciple of Confucius. He believed that man was essentially good. And therefore it was up to government to give the people what they wanted. If the government can win the hearts of the people, then they've won the people. So if the government's job is to figure out which way the political winds are blowing and go that way. Whichever way that political winds seem to be blowing, drift along with the wind and tide. The government should give what they want, give the people what they like, and not give them what they do not like, because everybody is basically good. This did not always work out. Governments felt like at times they just had to say, hey, no, we can't give you what you want, or we shouldn't give you what you want. Another view that developed, again an offshoot from Confucius, legalism. Now, legalism is the name of the Chinese philosophy. It simply means follow the law to the letter. It also says man is basically evil. And therefore it's up to government to step in and check man's tendency to do evil in any way the government can, arrest the worst offenders, put the worst offenders in jail, or even the worst offenders kill them. But the government should hold like a whip over the top of people and say you do right or else. That is legalism. Now, legalism is another term used to describe any form of philosophy that adheres to very strict interpretation of rules. Now, I'm going to get a little personal. I grew up in a legalistic environment where that everything you did that was right or that was enjoyable was considered wrong. You were always under judgment and condemnation, and also the people were always fighting each other because what you thought was right, this person over here thought was wrong, but then what this person over here thought was right, you think was wrong. So you were always arguing over what the rules should be, and you never could come to an agreement over what should the rules be. And things like length of skirt was a big issue, whether or not you should take aspirin, whether or not you should have the television, or what you should be allowed to watch on television. All this was part of the legalistic arguments that they had from time to time. And I myself developed something of a firm reaction against legalism, even though in actuality I think I keep most of life's rules pretty well. But be that as it may, the rules do not bind your hand and foot to where you can't enjoy life and where you can't move. Now, do any of you seem to know what I'm talking about? Okay, 2 or 3 hands. The other room, in the morning class, only 1 hand went up. Hopefully none of you will ever run into this, but if you do, you might meet someone who's a legalistic person. Yes?
Isn't legalism basically like you have to follow certain rules in order to earn favor with God?
Basically, that's it. Except the Chinese, they didn't know if there was a God or who God was. So there was just you had to follow certain rules in order to keep out of the wrath of the emperor. But among Christians, you have to follow these rules in order to keep favor with God. And yes.
And the opposite is licentiousness.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I heard a talk on that one time. They said there were 3 L's: licentious, legalism, and libertarian. The licentious person believes that I'm entitled to it. I'm going to do everything I please. Nobody's going to tell me what not to do, and he does supposedly everything, good or bad. The legalistic, everything is bad and wrong, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't do any of this stuff either. Now, the libertarian, he is not understood by either side. He generally does not break all of life's rules, and yet he breaks rules, a lot of rules that legalists would say he shouldn't break. But he is simply, he's free. He's not bound by the law. The law is his servant, not his master. There is a difference, folks. 2 men were told one day that they needed to stay at home and work overtime. Both men got on the phone and called their wives, told them they'd be late. The one man called his wife because he wanted to. The other man called his wife because he had to. There is a huge difference. So one man was free. He chose the right path. The other man knew he'd be clobbered if he got home without telling his wife where he was. He was in bondage. Hopefully I'm beginning to make a point clear. But again, legalist, always under judgment, always under condemnation, always under bondage. All right. I'm running out of time really fast. The next one is Taoism. The word Dao again has to do with way. Persons who like Taoism, it's had 2 types. Some of them just like the freedom it gave because it said you can choose your own way, to choose your own path. The other thing was it supplied a spirituality that Confucianism lacked, and the Taoists were oftentimes accused of practicing magic. Even though Taoists claimed that their belief is science, hardly any Westerner would call it science. The Taoist, some years ago, I got 2 or 3 letters from a Taoist claiming that they could make you live long time, very long time, maybe 150, 200 years, and still be young during that time if you use the right diet, right meditation, right exercise, and the right sexual technique. I asked a Chinese man about this one time. He said, yeah, but these men who claim they're 130 years old, you can never document their births. Be that as it may, he did not have a very high opinion of it. Taoism got your book shows a picture of Tao and Confucius meeting each other. They could not understand each other. Taoism supplied a spiritual vacuum that Confucius lacked, And it was, if nothing else, at least something of a spiritual religion. I'm going to have to move on. Well, I'll tell you what. Look up yourself the Qin dynasty, but a few things I must mention before we close. All right. If you see on the test, name a few things that Confucius taught. Again, he taught everybody had his own doll. He taught that the government should do the will of the people, not the other way around. Oh yes, the thing I was trying to think of was Silk Road. All right, Silk Road. Folk, today's history books emphasize it a lot. I went through 5 years of college and majored in history, undergrad and grad school without even knowing the Silk Road existed. Essentially, the Silk Road joined China to the Mediterranean world. Now, even though, as far as we know, no Chinese person ever actually went all the way to the Mediterranean, the goods would start in China, sell them to a merchant who would carry them farther and sell them to another merchant. By the time they got to the Mediterranean, the price was really high. And then goods from the Mediterranean world would find its way back. The route of the Silk Road varied from generation to generation, but essentially it was the route that got Chinese goods into the Mediterranean world. We'll have more to say about that later. All right. Now, something I want to say really quickly. Some things that these civilizations all had in common. First one was everything depended on the ability of the ruler to lead. His charisma, how wise he was. It was not a matter of he holds the office, so respect him for the office. Now, when I was in the Army, they told us when you pass an officer and you salute, you're not saluting the man behind the bars or behind the maple leaves or behind the stars or behind the bird. You're saluting his office. You're saluting those bars. You're saluting those stars. Never mind the man who's wearing them. You follow him because of the stars, the bars, or whatever he's wearing, without regard to the person behind him, who you might, in fact, not even like. But you follow him because he holds the office. The ancients did not understand that. They said you follow a man who can command your lead. In other words, you have to like him. But so much depended on the ability of a man and not on a system. Now, in our country, we try to make sure that it's the system, not the man. Some men, different men may occupy an office for a while, but the system goes on without any regard. That's why in the Army they tell the officers you must move. If you don't get promoted within a certain amount of time, you're kicked out of being an officer for good, then you're expected to move because they don't want to get tied up to where everybody knows to do things the officer's way. No, everybody does things the Army's way, without regard to the individual officer in charge. But anyway, everything depended on one man. Now, among the ancients, they were very, very religious. They didn't seem to have any skeptics among them. Now, folk, when we come back next week on Wednesday, we're going to visit Greece. We're going to talk about the Greeks. Among them, they had atheists, agnostics, religious skeptics of various shades and degrees. You don't find that in the ancient world before the Greeks. These people had no written constitution. Now, when you come to Greece and Rome, that changed. Greece had, some of their city-states had a written constitution, which they followed. In the United States, we don't follow an individual, we follow the Constitution. But in Greece, they had a constitution, but they had no constitution. Democracy was unknown to them, so it seems. They were somewhat different from us in that regard. They also, the rulers relied very heavily on their subordinates. In other words, like the Emperor of China would have to appoint governors throughout his provinces very heavily. Now, because they didn't have radio, they didn't have TV. Now, fast forward to the 20th century in contrast, Adolf Hitler had radio, telephone, airplanes, railroads, and he could be aware of what was going on all throughout Germany instantaneously. So he once bragged, nobody has ever had more authority than I have. Yeah, because he did not have to rule through subordinates as such. So he had helpers, but he didn't have to rule through subordinates. I mean, he could know what was going on instantly throughout his realm. Yes.
You were talking about the teachings that Confucius advocated for, like a couple, just.
I mentioned a couple, yeah, but I've got to move on because I'm running out of time. You can find one thing you hear is very materialistic. You have not dealt with government, practical aspects of daily living. Anyway, back to some of the things these civilizations had in common. Now in the future, folks, thanks to computers, which Hitler did not have, a dictator could actually decide every individual transaction. If you decide, I want to buy myself a motorcycle, the computer could say, hey, we decided you can't afford this, you can't have it. And they would guarantee that nobody got deeply into debt and everybody had the government control your spending for you. A future dictator could have more authority than that would even put that all to shame and take away all individual liberties and freedoms by telling everybody, hey, you go to work here, you need it here, and you go to work there whether you want to or not, or you're going to make this much money and you make that whether you want to or not. You must give your child an allowance and you give it whether you want to or not. Absolute control, the type of control that would even put Hitler to shame. But these people, they had to rule through subordinates. And they could not always guarantee the subordinates would do everything they wanted them to. A lot of times these people started out as nomadic herdsmen, and we're going to run into this throughout history. They'd start out as nomads. Then they would run into a civilization. They'd realize, hey, we're stronger than that civilization. They conquer it, copy the culture of that civilization, and after a while they become soft and be taken over by another nomadic tribe. And this cycle was to be repeated many a time throughout history. Poor people would eventually become rich, and the rich would often become poor. Their religions, if they did not start out polytheistic, they wound up ending polytheistic. Their gods would change over time. Some of the times the old gods would fade out of the pantheon completely, or sometimes become a very distant, unnoticed member of the pantheon. Lesser gods would rise to prominence. Higher gods would fall down. Skepticism, again, did not exist. Their religion among the common people, not necessarily among the emperors, but among the commoners, was often entwined with superstition, magic. Superstition and magic is described as the worst form of religion. The superstitious person is afraid of the gods, afraid if I walk under a ladder, which is really not a good idea anyway, but I better bring bad luck. Or if I find this horseshoe, the gods are obligated to give me good luck because I've got a horseshoe nailed to my door. Or if I find this 4 feet over, then basically the superstition says if I do the right rituals, I will have control of the gods and I'll be the master, the gods will be my slave. Magic is the same way. I'm the master, the gods do my bidding, the gods are my slave. And some people call these the very, very lowest and worst forms of religion, but they were common among these people. Their religions oftentimes had little to do with morals, and except for the very rich or the very high up, promised very, very little in the form of an afterlife. Their religion simply said, get all you can, strive to achieve, and the person who dies with the most toys wins. To quote a modern paraphrase, the person who dies with the biggest empire wins. And I've got to close. All right. Again, you'll see this lecture on iCollege and this morning's lecture also on iCollege. I urge you to study as hard as you can, and I hope you do well. The names, all of you hopefully know where Africa is, where North America is. If not, learn it. Learn it. Where India is, where China is, where England is. Hopefully you know all this. I'll see you Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.